ultimately, what's going to happen to energy bills will be decided by what happens in the war in Iran more than by what Andy Burnham's announced this week.
The new Prime Minister Andy Burnham's council house building promise is facing a funding gap which risks 5,000 fewer homes being built in a year. That's according to a new report which shows that to meet the building targets with purely social housing, the current £39 billion that's been set aside would need to be increased to £47 billion. Let's find out more. The reporters from the Resolution Foundation, its chief executive, Ruth Curtis, is with us now. Ruth, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Andy Burnham has promised a huge drive towards building far more social housing. What has he promised, and where do you think it's going to be tricky to deliver?
Yeah, so he's talked about the largest council house building programme in the post-war era. Now, we don't quite know what that means yet, but what we've had a look at this morning is, a council home often means a home at social rent. So something affordable in rent terms, about 50% of market rents. And that is the type of home that since 2010 we've seen very, very few built compared to history. So we've had a look this morning at how could Andy Burnham, within the current money allocated, build more of those homes? And he basically faces a trade-off between slightly fewer homes overall, but more of them being of this social rent type. And those are the numbers you talked about. The problem is these homes are expensive to build. They need a big subsidy from the government because they're not going to achieve commercial rents. And so if you wanted to get back to the sorts of scale of home building that we saw in the 90s or the 60s, then he would need a lot more money than is currently allocated.
Yeah, so the Times understands discussions are currently underway about diverting funds. You think that will have to be significant?
Exactly. So we looked at what could you do by diverting funds. So the government has set up something called the Social and Affordable Homes Programme. They've put a lot of money into that. It's 39 billion over the next 10 years. If all of that money was spent on social homes, at the moment it's only about 60%, then that would mean more social homes, but 5,000 homes a year overall less.
And this is really in essence because for council homes or social properties, tenants pay about 50% of the local market rate. So they then become more affordable for the tenant, but the buildings are then considerably more expensive to finance. So you need much greater government upfront grants.
Exactly. And basically what happened when housing budgets were cut in the 2010s, along with lots of other budgets, is the government really cut how many of these very affordable homes it built and kind of broadened the definitions of what would count as an affordable home. So if what Andy Burnham wants to do is revive that, there are some things he can do. He can reallocate money. We think there might be interesting things he could do with something called the National Housing Bank, which is going to provide cheap loans to housing associations. But if his ambition really is this kind of highest since the post-war, then that's such a big shift that it would undoubtedly need more money.
Yeah. I'd just like to get your evaluation really on what we've heard from the Prime Minister so far this week. Obviously, he got the job formally on Monday, and then we've heard quite a lot. Burnham announced plans to remove VAT from household electricity bills, reinstate a £2 bus fare cap, cuts to business rates. You know, it was sort of a big financial announcement every day this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. What he's wanting to do is to create breathing room on the cost of living. Do you think the policies announced so far suggest a change in stance from government that's going to be able to achieve that?
So the announcements this week are small in some sense. So the energy bill is about £45 for a typical household. The government had already taken £150 off bills in April, but we've already seen that global events can overwhelm these sorts of measures from the government. So on the one hand, when you give everyone a little bit of money, inevitably it's quite small per person. On the other, these are big moves, I think, when you think about the overall kind of government picture. They're big things to do on a single day, if you like. And so breathing room perhaps is not an unreasonable phrase. They are small relative to the increase in bills we've seen since 2022, for example. Energy bills are up about 26% over and above the rise in prices. But they might be enough to avoid rises in October. So ultimately, what's going to happen to energy bills will be decided by what happens in the war in Iran more than by what Andy Burnham's announced this week. But £45 is a pretty big move from the government.
Yeah. I mean, Kemi Badenoch has said Andy Burnham needs to rule out tax rises to pay for this spending spree. Two things. Would you call it a spending spree? And do you think it's possible to do it without raising taxes elsewhere, somewhere else?
So I think Andy Burnham's spent about £2 billion this week. That's because that's if these measures continue into the future. And that's been a bit unclear this week. But do we really think that what's going to happen in April is he's going to put up energy bills by 5%? That doesn't feel consistent with what he's promised on the cost of living. So if they were to be permanent, then the kind of total annual cost would be about £2 billion of everything he's announced this week. That is not, a huge proportion of the total public finances because they're so massive, but it is a pretty big number. When I worked in the Treasury, that would be a chunky line in a budget. And so he has spent a lot of money for someone who hasn't had a budget this week, is how I would put it.
Do you think number 10 North is going to cost more than anticipated?
I don't know about the details of number 10 North and how much that will cost, but I do think the broader point is what he said in how he's going to pay for things, to the extent that he has this week, is about taking money largely from departments, money that was allocated to departmental budgets, and saying we're going to cut those and instead we're going to put it back in people's pockets, as he would say. And that's really the big choice when we come to the autumn is he going to reduce public spending, or is he going to do things on welfare or taxes that affect how much incomes people have? And if this week is anything to go by, you would say, well, maybe the signs are that he's keen to cut those departmental budgets. But the problem with doing that big picture is that will start to rub up against these very big priorities, whether that is number 10 North or the NHS or house building.
Yeah, and maybe that's why we're seeing a slight realignment maybe of previous priorities. If we look at the front page of the Times today, Andy Burnham's ready to move quickly to scale up North Sea oil and gas production. There is sort of endless debates, Ruth, about what this does to our actual any bills. The consensus often saying, look, it's going to support the economy, particularly around Aberdeen, and prop up jobs there. But actually, for our energy bills, it's not going to make that much difference. Why do you think we're seeing sort of changing tack from Andy Burnham in terms of a Labour government stance on new oil and gas drilling licences?
Yeah, I mean, we've been waiting for a long time for these decisions about these two oil fields. And I think, as you say, it's unlikely, because energy prices are set around the world, it's unlikely to have a big direct effect on bills. It might have some effect on the tax that we collect. Energy companies are now taxed with a particular levy. And so what you could see is some extra revenue if those decisions were taken.
Yeah. OK. Final thing, Ruth. Just in terms of the tone that's been set by Andy Burnham, a little bit later we're going to compare just the very first few days of Keir Starmer compared to Andy Burnham in terms of Keir Starmer's often talking about, those with the broadest shoulders will have to help. Andy Burnham said he wanted to give a message of hope. That word came up so many times. Is this tonally different in terms of what he's saying about what the economy will look like for the average person?
So he's certainly decided to kick off with positivity, hasn't he? He's decided to spend money to try and give people a sense that he understands that cost of living is their biggest concern and that he's trying to do something about it. I guess in the end, why did Keir Starmer sound a bit pessimistic in those early days? It was because he tells us when he arrived in office, the public finances were in a worse position than he expected. And so what really matters in the end is when we get to the autumn, does Andy Burnham have a way to pay for these things that won't feel like it's taking money back away from people, or in fact will paying for all of these things and the much bigger question of defence and the economic impact of the war in Iran is already likely to mean that borrowing is much higher than we expected in March. So how he squares that circle will probably, when we look back, feel like more defining than his first week.
Ruth, this has been really helpful. Thank you. Ruth Curtis, the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation.
Just on the politics of that, there's a question that emerges about how constrained Team Burnham is going to be by the manifesto on which Keir Starmer was elected and that Andy Burnham says he's going to stick to. And will there come a point where the things he wants to do, the options of the things he wants to do, runs out by virtue of being sort of fenced in by this manifesto? And does he need to spring himself from that manifesto? And does that come in the form of an election? Discuss. I wonder if the budget's going to be a bit of a reality check, actually, when it comes to Burnham's freedoms or otherwise.